Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore from all over the world and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I'm so grateful to have you here with me today. If you're new to the podcast, welcome on in. It's a pleasure to have you here with me. I really hope you enjoy it here, and if you do, please feel free to subscribe wherever you're listening, and you can also follow me over on Blue Sky and TikTok. Links to these will be in the show notes as per usual. I also did actually show my face on TikTok for the first time. Went okay. I do have a bit of a lazy eye. Did notice that. That was a bit of a source of self-consciousness. But there we go. If this is the first episode of Ladies of Lore you're listening to, you may very well want to jump back an episode, as this is part 2 of our exploration into Guinevere. Yes, last week we spoke quite a lot about her origins and her appearances in more earlier works by Chrétien de Troyes and also in the Vulgate cycle, and we also chatted about various other bits and pieces which set us up very nicely for today's episode. So if you missed it, backtrack a little bit and come back to this one afterwards. Trust me, because it will make a lot more sense. But equally, if you just fancy going rogue and dropping in at part 2, go for it. You're crazy. I like it. On the note of the two-parter, please do let me know if you've liked this format of a bit of a deeper dive, because I put more quotes in, I'm reading you more things, and if you like that, please do let me know. I say it all the time, but I am so open to feedback on these episodes because I want to make this a thing that you guys want to hear. So let me know in the comments if two-parters are something you'd like more of. And thank you so much for all the feedback on last week's episode. You guys seem to really love the Arthurian episodes, and I very much enjoy bringing them to you, so there will definitely be more of these to come because I'm having the best time researching, writing and recording them for you. Now, if you're ready, let's crack on with part 2 of all things Guinevere. As we've already discussed in last week's episode, Guinevere's portrayal has evolved dramatically over the centuries, and these changes didn't stop coming with the Vulgate cycle, oh no. The 15th century saw Sir Thomas Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur of around 1485 emerge as perhaps one of the most enduring versions of the Arthurian legend, and it provides a particularly interesting portrayal of Guinevere. Mallory synthesises elements from earlier French and English texts, presenting Guinevere as a noble but flawed queen. Her love for Lancelot is depicted in quite a similar way to the previous versions, deeply passionate, yet ultimately tragic, and leading to Arthur's downfall. In the final chapters, after Arthur's death, Guinevere again retreats to a convent, spending the rest of her life in penitence. But here is a little interesting thing to consider that maybe slightly changes the way that we view Guinevere. In the Vulgate cycle, Guinevere flees to the nunnery after hearing of the battle between Arthur and Mordred, so it's almost out of necessity. She has to go. She's got nowhere else to go. Whereas in Morte, Guinevere is already aware that Mordred and Arthur have fallen, so going to the nunnery and giving up her courtly life is an active choice. In this way, she's showing a lot more agency than she did in the Vulgate cycle, and we will definitely be talking a little bit more about this particular choice a little bit later on in the episode. These changes reflect the shifting literary and cultural values of the period in which each work was composed. And when I go back to the very first episode of Ladies of Lore, I believe I said that myths change in this way all the time, and that's rock and roll. Why did I say that? I don't know. I think I was nervous. It was my first time. I have gone back to that episode actually, and I have listened, and I'm wondering if perhaps I should do a Medusa 2.0 episode now I've found my rhythm a little bit, and if that's something that you'd like to hear, please do let me know. Anyway, as I said earlier, at times in the Vulgate cycle, Guinevere is depicted in a harsher light. She's often seen as proud, jealous, and sometimes even cruel. The double banishing was definitely not called for, if you ask me. And she's usually the cause for the actions of male characters, but has very little agency or complexity of her own. And this portrayal aligns with the courtly love culture of medieval France, where women were often idealised but also held responsible for moral and social disruption. Her character in the Vulgate cycle embodies this tension between the idealised femininity and the perception of women as sources of temptation and chaos. And let's think religion for a second, because here you have this beautiful woman tempting a man away from the godly path and into sin, eventually leading to ruin and chaos. And who does that make you think of? In some ways, the character arc of Guinevere is an allegory for that of Eve in the Bible, and in turn, a stark warning about the dangers of sin and corruption by women. And Mallory's Guinevere is even more complex, embodying a slightly more tragic nobility. While her love for Lancelot is still the catalyst for Camelot's downfall, she's not portrayed as a deliberately scheming or cruel person. Instead, she's a woman caught between love and duty. And her final decision to reject Lancelot and devote herself to God is depicted as an act of sincere penitence. And as I said, it's evidence of this newfound agency that she has in Mallory's retelling. And I actually read a really fascinating text, which I will include in the show notes, of course, that explores this in a lot more detail along with other females in the Vulgate cycle and Morte Arthur. And there's a quote from that I really think sums up what I've just said. And it goes like this. Unlike the Vulgate's Guinevere, the one in Morte acts. She tests the boundaries of her societal restrictions and eventually manages to overcome them somewhat. Unlike her character in the French cycle, Mallory's Guinevere experiences an actual development of her character. She goes from complying with her social function in a patriarchal society to rebelling against it, finding agency in religious life. Like I said, I'm going to include that whole academic text in the show notes because it really is such an interesting exploration through a feminist lens, and I'm sure there are probably some of you out there who will enjoy reading it just as much as I did. And here's another question for us to explore a little bit. Why did Mallory do this? Why did he decide to present Guinevere in this way? The answer lies in courtly love. Because courtly love, it's a bit of a paradox, really. On one side of the coin, it's the source of all of the good stuff about the chivalric code. Being in love can take a man and put him in his most noble form. He's sincere, he's loyal and brave and generous and kind. But on the other side of this, courtly love is also, by definition, immoral and adulterous. And it was actually very much condemned by the church. And it was this paradoxical nature that Mallory exploited in Morte Arthur. It could be, as the scholar Charles Moorman suggests, that he felt the courtly love was evil, and he wanted to show its tragic effect both on the characters and its role in the destruction of the Round Table and Camelot. And there's a really interesting chapter about this all in Moorman's The Unity of Mallory's Morte Arthur, which goes into a little bit more detail about what I've just said. But equally, this could just be Mallory being, much like Guinevere, a bit torn about courtly love. And doesn't the tale of Guinevere and Lancelot show this duality very, very clearly? The romantic, intense love contrasted with the destructive nature of their affair. And we've spoken at length about Guinevere and Lancelot, but I just wanted to highlight another little bit of Morte Arthur, which shows yet another side of Guinevere, her cunning. In the tale, Mordred attempts to force Guinevere to marry him and solidify his claim to the throne. Guinevere actually pretends to agree to the marriage, but she requests that she's able to go to London to prepare and buy wedding stuff. And once she gets there, she actually takes refuge inside the Tower of London, locking herself inside and refusing to leave. And this is a huge act of defiance, and it delays Mordred's plans, forcing him to attempt to besiege the tower, and it also buys Arthur time to return and confront him. Again, this is quite a big display of agency and resistance, and it's not something we've seen yet in Guinevere in previous versions of the tale. She really said, "No, I'm going to lock myself up in this tower, and there's nothing you can do about it, and I'm going to wait for my husband to come and beat you up." And she also actually has some political agency and importance in Mallory's version too. So upon returning from their quests, knights must offer an account or a verbal performance of their adventures to Guinevere, and she decides whether their behaviours are knightly or not. Now I'm saying it out loud, it kind of feels like a game show, doesn't it? Imagine, the knights have to come on stage and do a little spoken word slam poetry performance about the quest that they've just been on, and Guinevere decides if they get through to the next round and get to keep their knighthood or not. Pitch that to the BBC. But in all seriousness, this is an example of Guinevere having a little bit of actual power. And she does actually go on to initiate justice upon Gawain, and this justice comes by ordinance of the Queen, not by ordinance of Arthur. Now, we all know that medieval women didn't really have an official role. They could sometimes intervene in things through counsel or influence through flattery, but here in Mallory's Morte Arthur, we see Guinevere in a position of actual authority, in the position of a judge. Again, there's so much more agency for her here. In fact, there are so many examples of Guinevere actually having a lot more control over situations than what we see in prior versions. Listen to this quote. This is where Guinevere is speaking to Meligand when he attempts to take her after the Battle of Camelot. Now, it is in Old English, so I'm going to read it as best I can. Traitorous knight, what cast thou to do? Wilt thou shame thyself? Bethink thee how thou art a king's son and a knight of the Table Round, and thou thus to be about to dishonour the noble king that made the knight. Thou shamest all knighthood and thyself. And me I lat the white thou shalt never shame, for I had liever cut mine own throat in twain, rather than thou should dishonour me. It's a bit scathing, isn't it? She speaks over and over again of shame, essentially saying, come on mate, don't make an idiot of yourself. I would rather cut my own throat than go with you. It's a really strong response and not one that we might expect to hear, especially not in the Guinevere of de Troyes, for instance. And she goes on to exhibit even more agency because Meligand doesn't really listen to this to start with and he actually continues to attack. And when Guinevere sees that many of her men are being wounded, she shouts to him, Sir Meligand, slay not my noble knights, and I will go with thee, upon thy covenant, that thou save them, and suffer them no more to be hurt, with this, that they be led with me, wheresomever thou leadst me. For I will rather slay myself than I will go with thee, only that these noble knights may be in my presence. So here she's saying, can you please stop hurting my knights? That's enough. And again, I'd rather die than go with you. Didn't you hear me the first time? And guess what? Meligand actually listens to Guinevere, and the knights stop fighting. In the grand scheme of things, this might not seem like much, but remember, if you will, how much power and agency and control women had at this time. And here is Guinevere saying, oi, stop fighting, and they actually listen. And as I said, there's plenty more examples of this newfound assertive Guinevere, but the last one I'll mention is a bit of a backtrack on something I said briefly earlier, and that is Guinevere's choice to go to the nunnery. As I said, Guinevere in Morte Arthur has all of the knowledge of Arthur and Mordred's death. She knows the battle has happened, she knows Camelot has fallen, and she knows that she can never return to the life that she once had. She's just rejected Meligand, and in the wake of the battle, Lancelot goes to Guinevere, another man with another plan to have her. And when he gets to her, he asks her to come with him to France, where they can live together upon his lands. Which, in all fairness, sounds like a pretty decent deal, really. But instead, she rejects him, and this is what she says. Sir Lancelot, wit thou well I am set in such a plight to get my soul healed, that after my death I may have a sight of the blessed face of Christ Jesu. And therefore, Sir Lancelot, I require thee, and I beseech thee heartily, for all the love that was ever betwixt us, that thou never see me no more in the visage, and I command thee, on Goddess' behalf, that thou forsake my company. Pretty bloody tragic, isn't it? For all the love that ever was betwixt us. It's just a really powerful line. And we don't use the word betwixt enough anymore. I am all for a betwixt resurgence. And she also goes on to tell him to go to his realm and take a wife. And to this, Lancelot says, Now, my sweet madam, would ye that I should turn again unto my country and there to wed a lady? Nay, madam, wit you well that shall I never do, for I shall never be so false unto you of that I have promised. But the same destiny that ye have taken you to, I will take me to, for to please Jesu, and ever for you I cast me specially to pray. And you already know the rest. She goes to Amesbury Abbey, where she devotes her life to God, and Lancelot does the same, and upon her death he comes to bury her. And there we go. A slightly more assertive, agency-fueled Guinevere, in Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, but still a tragic tale of love and betrayal. So what came next? Well, to be honest with you, interest in Guinevere and Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table took what can only be described as a bit of a nosedive, mainly owing to the reign of King James I of 1603 to 1625. And you might be thinking, well, what does that have to do with anything, India? I'll tell you. James I wasn't really interested in the chivalric ideas that had long been associated with King Arthur and the legends of the Round Table. Unlike his Tudor predecessors who had embraced Arthur as a national figure, Henry VII, for instance, even traced his lineage to Arthur, and Henry VIII used Arthurian imagery to strengthen his rule, James didn't really see the legendary king as a useful political symbol. Instead, he focused on uniting England and Scotland under his rule and promoted his own vision of kingship, which was deeply influenced by his belief in the divine right of kings. So kings that have descended from the gods and the power of them comes from the gods. An Arthurian legend with its tales of knights bound by a chivalric code rather than absolute royal authority didn't really align with James's idea of what a monarchy should look like. It was well known that James hated medieval romances and knightly pursuits. He thought chivalry, that's outdated, that's irrelevant, and he preferred scholarly pursuits and religious debates over the tales of heroic knights and their quests. So naturally, this attitude seeped into literature. And under James, writings shift away from romanticised tales of the past and towards more satirical, intellectual and political themes. Scholars and writers of the Jacobean era were more interested in classical antiquity than medieval myth, leading to a literary culture that valued realism, history and rationalism over fantastical romances. And this shift was further reinforced by the growing influence of Protestantism. Sorry, my brain just stopped working then. The influence of Protestantism. Think about it. The Arthurian tales often contained elements of Catholic mysticism. Think the Holy Grail and this type of imagery. It's very Catholic, isn't it? And it was increasingly viewed with scepticism in a Protestant nation that was actively and often violently distancing itself from Catholic tradition. Another key factor in the decline of Arthurian popularity was the rise of new national myths. As James sought to unite England and Scotland, he encouraged narratives that emphasised British unity rather than English medieval legends. Figures like Brutus of Troy, a mythical founder of Britain, and historical things, I suppose he was a thing, historical kings like Alfred the Great began to be seen as more fitting symbols of national identity over the legendary Arthur. And guys, I'm sorry, I can't talk today, and this is my job, is to talk to you guys, and I just keep getting words wrong, and if I was to sit here and edit them all out, it would take me longer to edit than it would to actually record it, so you're going to have to deal with some of my Indiaisms today. But I digress. So by the time of James I's death in 1625, Arthurian folklore had largely faded from popular and political discourse. And while it never disappeared entirely, it wouldn't see a major revival until the 19th century, when Romantic and Victorian writers discovered the legend all over again and reshaped it for a new audience. The Victorians reignited their love for Arthurian myth as part of a broader cultural revival of medievalism, driven by a longing for chivalric ideals, national identity, and moral instruction. This resurgence was shaped by the works of poets, novelists, and artists who saw in the Arthurian legend both a reflection of their own values and a response to the challenges of their time. One of the key figures responsible for this revival was Alfred Lord Tennyson, whose Idylls of the King reimagined the Arthurian stories as a grand moralistic epic. Tennyson's Arthur was a noble but tragic figure, an embodiment of Victorian ideals, honourable, disciplined and duty-bound, but ultimately doomed by human weakness and moral failure. The tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, Gawain and the Green Knight, and the quest for the Holy Grail were reshaped into allegories about purity, faith, and the decay of noble ideals. For the Victorians, who were deeply concerned with morality, the decline of Camelot mirrored their anxieties about the corruption and fragility of their own society. In Idylls of the King, Tennyson presents Queen Guinevere as a deeply complex and tragic figure whose love affair with Sir Lancelot again ultimately leads to the downfall of King Arthur's utopian vision. Tennyson's depiction of Guinevere is shaped by Victorian ideals of morality, purity, and the consequences of personal failure, particularly from a woman's perspective. Tennyson presents a more psychologically nuanced version of Guinevere, who embodies both passionate desire and deep remorse. And Guinevere's portrayal aligns with Tennyson's overarching themes of idealism versus human frailty. Arthur, in the poem, represents an almost saint-like figure. He's noble and just and unwavering in his moral duty, while Guinevere, by contrast, is depicted as weak in character, unable to resist her emotions, and ultimately responsible for the unravelling of the Round Table. This moral dichotomy reflects Victorian anxieties about female sexuality and agency, reinforcing this idea that a woman's failure to embody purity and restraint can lead to catastrophic consequences. And really, this isn't too far from what we discussed earlier with Guinevere as a bit of a mirror of Eve. While Lancelot, despite his own feelings, is given moments of heroism and redemption, Guinevere bears the full weight of moral judgment in this narrative. I read Idylls of the King, and honestly, Arthur's final meeting with Guinevere at the convent is deeply, deeply emotional. In this scene, Arthur confronts Guinevere not with anger, but in sorrow. His words reflect his disappointment and his pain, rather than outright condemnation. And that reinforces this sort of Christ-like patience and forgiveness that Tennyson attributes to him throughout Idylls of the King. And there's part of me that would just love to sit and read you guys the whole thing. But don't worry, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually just going to pick a few of what I think are the most gut-punching parts that really show the way that Arthur tackles this. Fear not. Thou shalt be guarded till my death. Howbeit I know, if ancient prophecies have erred not, that I march to meet my doom. Thou hast not made my life so sweet to me, that I the king should greatly care to live, for thou hast spoiled the purpose of my life. Bear with me for the last time, while I show, even for thy sake, the sin which thou hast sinned. So what he's saying to her is, she spoiled his life. She ruined the whole purpose of his life. To him, being married to Guinevere, leading the kingdom, that was his purpose. But she spoiled it all with her affair with Lancelot. All of the blame for everything that has gone wrong falls to Guinevere, while Arthur is this Christ-like, moralistic character who hasn't done anything wrong. And this next bit really is Arthur sort of twisting the knife a little bit, really trying to make her feel bad and make us as an audience feel sympathy for him. I made them lay their hands in mine and swear to reverence the king, as if he were their conscience, and their conscience as their king, to break the heathen and uphold the Christ, to ride abroad redressing human wrongs, to speak no slander, no, nor to listen to it, to honour his words as if his gods, to lead sweet lives in purest chastity, to love one maiden only, cleave to her, and worship her by years of noble deeds, until they won her. For indeed I knew of no more subtle master under heaven than is the maiden passion for a maid, not only to keep down the base in man, but teach high thought, and amiable words, and courtliness, and the desire of fame, and love of truth, and all that makes a man. And all this throve before I wedded thee, believing, lo, mine helpmate, one to feel my purpose and rejoicing in my joy. Then came thy shameful sin with Lancelot. And he's just describing how amazing things were before Guinevere here. He had his knights. He taught them to be kind, to be amiable, to lead lives that were devoted to only one woman at a time. And when he found Guinevere, he thought, amazing, this is my person. This is the one that I will continue this legacy with. And then it all came down after she sinned and had her affair with Lancelot. And he goes on. And to be honest with you, you do sort of start to feel a bit sorry for him here. Of all my heart had destined did obtain, and all through thee, so that this life of mine I guard as God's high gift from scathe and wrong. not greatly care to lose, but rather think how sad it were for Arthur, should he live, to sit once more within his lonely hall, and miss the wonted number of my knights, and miss to hear high talk of noble deeds as in the golden days before thy sin. For which of us who might be left could speak of the pure heart, nor seem to glance at thee? And in thy bowers of Camelot or of Usk, thy shadow still would glide from room to room, and I should evermore be vexed with thee in hanging robe or vacant ornament, or ghastly footfall echoing on the stair. For think not, though thou wouldst not love thy Lord hast wholly lost his love for thee. And I don't know about you, but reading that just conjures this picture of Arthur, alone in his castle, no more knights of the Round Table, no more Lancelot who he once held so dear, and the ghost of Guinevere and her affair following him, haunting him in every room. It's pretty powerful stuff. And for a reason, because we're feeling sorry for Arthur now, and all of the blame, all of the negative feelings are going to Guinevere. She is unpure. She is immoral. Her affair has led to this, and Arthur is about to go and die in a battle that wouldn't be happening if she hadn't had her affair with Lancelot. And to make it even worse, Arthur forgives her. And all is past, the sin is sinned. And I forgive thee, as eternal God forgives. Do thou for thine own soul the rest. But how to take last leave of all I loved? O golden hair, with which I used to play, not knowing. O imperial moulded form, and beauty such as never woman wore, until it became a kingdom's curse with thee. I cannot touch thy lips, they are not mine, but Lancelot's. Nay, they were never the king's. I cannot take thy hand, that too is flesh, and in the flesh thou hast sinned, and mine own flesh, here, looking down on thine polluted, cries, I loathe thee, yet not less, O Guinevere, for I was ever virgin, save for thee. So yeah, he forgives her. He forgives her. And that is the ultimate Christ depiction right there. After everything she's done, after all of the destruction that she's caused, he knows he's going to his death. And in his final act before he dies, he forgives her. And Guinevere is absolutely overcome with guilt and regret, and she acknowledges her role in Arthur's downfall, and she breaks down in repentance. And she chooses then to dedicate herself to a life of penance in the convent. And that mirrors this Victorian ideal that a fallen woman must atone for her sins through suffering and isolation. And this is what she says. So let me, if you do not shudder at me, nor shun to call me sister, dwell with you. Wear black and white, and be a nun like you. Fast with your fasts, not feasting with your feasts. Grieve with your griefs, not grieving at your joys, but not rejoicing. Mingle with your rites, pray and be prayed for. Lie before your shrines. Do each low office of your holy house. Walk your dim cloister, and distribute dole to poor sick people, richer in his eyes who ransomed us, and haler too than I, and treat their loathsome hurt and heal mine own, and so wear out in almsdeed and in prayer the sombre close of that voluptuous day, which wrought the ruin of my lord the king. And Guinevere's final redemption is very significant because it suggests that while she's caused great harm, she isn't beyond salvation. And that adds a bit of a layer of complexity to Tennyson's moral framework, because it allows for the possibility that even those who have failed morally to seek forgiveness and to transform. However, her repentance does not undo the damage that she's caused, and Arthur departs, leaving her with the painful knowledge of what she has lost. And this scene encapsulates the poem's broader meditation on human imperfection and the impossibility of sustaining utopian ideals in a flawed world. Tennyson's portrayal of Guinevere is also deeply reflective of Victorian gender norms, particularly the belief that women were expected to embody purity, devotion, and most of all, restraint. In contrast to Arthur's unwavering moral vision, Guinevere's weakness and emotional transgression serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked passion. Yet, despite her moral failings, she is ultimately given a path to redemption, suggesting that no, she can't undo the past, but she can still strive for spiritual salvation. And this is quite a complex portrayal, and it makes her one of the most compelling figures in Idols of the King, because she embodies both the tragic consequence of human weakness and the possibility of grace through repentance. So there's a massively deep dive into Tennyson's retelling and exploration of Guinevere. I know I read you quite a lot there, and I hope you liked that. If you didn't, that's fine. Please let me know in the comments, because I'm more than happy to include more things like that on future episodes, or equally not if that's not what you're into. Another reason for the revival of Arthurian tales was the Victorian fascination with chivalry and the medieval past. The Industrial Revolution had rapidly modernised Britain, bringing great progress but also great social upheaval. Many Victorians, particularly those of upper and middle classes, romanticised the Middle Ages as a time of noble knights, honour, and clear social order, which was a stark contrast to the growing urbanisation, class struggles, and materialism of the 19th century. And this nostalgia for an idealised past was expressed in architecture too, with the rise of Gothic revival, and also in art, in particular with the pre-Raphaelite movement, and also in literature. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group of artists including Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris, and they played a significant role in popularising Arthurian imagery. Their paintings depicted Arthurian scenes with rich, dreamlike detail, emphasising romance, beauty and medieval aesthetics. And Morris also adapted Arthurian themes into his writing and decorative designs, further embedding the legends into Victorian culture. Arthurian myth was also embraced as a tool for moral instruction, particularly in education and literature aimed at young people. The Victorians saw in King Arthur's knights a model for Christian virtue, self-discipline and noble behaviour. Writers like Howard Pyle and Sidney Lanier adapted? See, it's another Indiaism. They adapted the legends into children's books, emphasising lessons of courage, honour and sacrifice. Additionally, the Arthurian revival was tied to British national identity. In an era of expanding empire, the Victorians sought historical and mythical figures to define their greatness, and Arthur, the legendary British king, was an ideal candidate. Just as the Tudors had used Arthurian imagery to strengthen their rule, the Victorians saw the legend as a reflection of their own imperial destiny. Arthur's unfulfilled dream of a perfect kingdom resonated with Britain's sense of itself as a global power striving for moral and civilizational leadership. We're talking about colonialism here, guys, which, let's be real, had very little morals. But I digress. That's another story for another episode. Perhaps over on Patreon we can talk about colonialism. So, as you can see, by the end of the 19th century, Arthurian myth had become deeply woven into British cultural life once again. The legends were no longer merely old medieval tales, but had been reinterpreted as moral allegories. They were artistic inspiration, and they were nationalistic symbols. This Victorian reinvention would set the stage for further reinterpretations in the 20th century. So let's take a little look at how Guinevere appears in the modern day. Guinevere continues to appear in modern media, across literature, film, television, music and art. Her portrayal has evolved significantly, reflecting contemporary perspectives on love, power, betrayal and female agency. In literature, Guinevere remains a subject of fascination, particularly in feminist retellings and reimaginings that focus on her perspective, rather than her just being Arthur's queen or Lancelot's lover. One notable example is The Mists of Avalon of 1983 by Marion Zimmer Bradley, which presents her as a devoutly Christian woman struggling against the rising influence of the old pagan ways. Now, yes, I know I have said previously about this book and how I do not support it due to Marion Zimmer Bradley's past, but I will just say that if you do buy this book, the publisher has stated that all proceeds go to children's charities, and rightly so. But yes, this version casts her in a more passive, pious light, emphasising her inner conflicts rather than her role in a love triangle. And another compelling reimagining comes from The Queen of Camelot of 2002 by Nancy Mackenzie, and this portrays Guinevere as a strong, intelligent ruler rather than merely a pawn in the affairs of men. And more recently, Cheryl Carpinello reinvents Guinevere in her book series and casts her as a young woman embarking on an adventurous journey. And this is aimed more at younger readers, and it appeals to them by emphasising her courage and her independence. And Cheryl Carpinello actually has quite a few mythology and folklore books, all aimed at younger readers, including ones on Guinevere and various other figures. So if you have some little people in your life, this might be a good option for them. And here's one that one of my friends recommended to me, so thank you, Katie. Gwen and Art Are Not in Love. And this was from 2023, and it's written by Lex Croucher. Now, this is really interesting because it's a queer, comedic reimagining of Arthurian legend, and it subverts the traditional portrayals of Guinevere, but it also embraces modern themes of identity, duty, and romance. So in this one, Guinevere, who's referred to as Gwen, is betrothed to Arthur, or Art. And it's a politically motivated marriage, but they both secretly harbour their own romantic inclination. So Gwen is in love with a woman, and Art is in love with a man. And rather than being sort of a tragic or doomed romantic figure that we often have seen in classic Arthurian retellings, Gwen here is portrayed as a sharp-witted and strong-willed woman who's reluctant to conform to societal expectations. And this version of Guinevere steps far away from her conventional role as the faithful but kind of unfaithful queen caught in a love triangle with Arthur and Lancelot, and instead she's presented as a young woman struggling against the constraints of a patriarchal system that seeks to control her future. And her relationship with Art transforms from an obligatory engagement into an alliance based on mutual understanding and shared secrets. And the novel's humorous and irreverent tone make her character feel quite refreshingly modern, actually, and it turns her into a protagonist who's got some agency rather than just a passive figure whose fate is dictated by the men around her. So by blending the elements of historical fiction with LGBTQ plus themes, Gwen and Art Are Not in Love challenges traditional Arthurian narratives while still engaging with their central motifs of love, duty, and destiny. Guinevere, in this context, is not a mere romantic object, and she's not just a tragic figure. She's actually a vibrant, self-aware young woman navigating a world that expects her to fit the mould that she refuses to accept. So there are some books to add to your list or your TBR, and if you're joining the Patreon, perhaps they might even pop up in the Ladies of Law book club. Who knows? Film and television have also shaped Guinevere's image, sometimes romanticising her role and other times adding a little bit more complexity to her character. In First Night of 1995, Julia Ormond plays a conflicted yet dignified Guinevere, torn between her love for Lancelot, portrayed by Richard Gere, and her duty to Sean Connery's King Arthur. And this film, it leans much more into the romantic elements of her legend, emphasising her struggle between passion and responsibility. I've not seen this movie, but I did watch a few clips, and I read some of the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. One of my favourite reviews simply states, Excalibur, and another one, Camelot became Camelite. Honestly, I wish I was this creative. I love reading other people's movie reviews. They make me laugh so much. I can never think of anything that funny to say. Jerry Bruckheimer's King Arthur of 2004 presents a unique take on Guinevere. Here she's played by Keira Knightley, and she's a fierce Pictish warrior rather than a noble queen embroiled in a love triangle. Influenced by the film's attempt at a more historically accurate Arthur, this version discards medieval romance in favour of political and military conflict. Initially a Roman prisoner, Guinevere is freed by Arthur and proves herself a skilled archer and fighter, engaging in battle against the Saxons. Her romance with Arthur, who's played by Clive Owen, is based on mutual respect and alliance rather than courtly love. And this omits the traditional Lancelot-Guinevere-Arthur triangle too. And her role symbolises the unification of the Picts and of Arthur's knights, reinforcing the film's theme of Britain's fight for independence. Her costume did spark a bit of debate, though. I'd say it's battle-ready yet revealing. And like I say, it did cause a bit of a stir, especially when it came to historical accuracy and sexualisation, because it reflects the film's attempt to create this iconic, stylised warrior, and some did appreciate this depiction and said it was empowering to see a woman in a more masculine role. But others actually criticised it for this because they said that it reinforced traditional gender roles because it equated strength with masculine-coded traits, which is a really interesting way to think about it. And producer Jerry Bruckheimer also admitted that Guinevere was made a warrior to attract both male and female audiences. And that just emphasises this sort of duality as both fierce and feminine. And out there is a really interesting analysis of this movie by Virginia Blanton. And I read it. And in this analysis, she sort of situates King Arthur within the broader tradition of Arthurian adaptations and highlights how the film's more quote-unquote historical approach alters Guinevere's role. And the marketing for this movie emphasised her as definitely an action hero. Yet Blanton argues that this reimagining still limits her agency within a male-dominated narrative. So despite wielding weapons and fighting alongside knights, she still remains dependent on Arthur and other male figures for protection and progression. And Blanton critiques the film's costuming choices as well, saying that in some ways it is empowering, but in other ways it's very objectifying, and it's designed to appeal to modern audiences, but also catering to the male gaze too. And she goes into quite a lot of detail about the film's marketing. I read quite a lot of interviews with Keira Knightley, and they're all just really interesting takes, and I will put the link in the show notes to that article so you can have a read. And one of the most striking examples of Guinevere's compromised autonomy in this movie is a line from Arthur where he says, "Don't worry, I won't let them rape you." And Blanton argues that this exemplifies patriarchal protectionism, and it portrays Guinevere's safety as something that's only granted by men rather than controlled by her. And really, including this sexual violence as a plot device, that puts Arthur in a position of her saviour, and in doing so, diminishes her agency somewhat. So it's really interesting because while some audiences saw this warrior Guinevere as a refreshing departure from passive portrayals, feminist critics found it a bit of a superficial change that didn't really give Guinevere true narrative independence. And the film was marketed as progressive, but its gender dynamics remained mostly traditional, reinforcing the idea that female strength must align with masculine traits to be valid. And I'd be interested to know if any of you guys have seen that movie. What do you think? Do you like this portrayal of Guinevere, or do you think that perhaps more could have been done? And here's another one for all of you Tumblr girlies out there, the BBC television series Merlin of 2008 to 2012, which offers a bit of a different take, and it casts Angel Colby as Guinevere, and she's a servant here who rises to become queen. And this adaptation challenges traditional depictions of her as an aristocratic figure, and instead makes her more of a self-made woman. And it also introduces themes of race and class into Arthurian storytelling. In fact, this is the very first time that we see Guinevere as anything other than white. And I'm sure you can imagine how some audience members reacted to this. Women of colour have had a long tradition of playing servants in literature and media. They usually occupy secondary roles or helper roles. And I read a really incredible chapter about this in Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's book. That was a bit of a mouthful. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's book, which is called The Dark Fantastic. And it's such a fascinating book, and it discusses race in fantasy literature. And in this chapter, specifically about Guinevere in Merlin, Ebony commented on how intriguing it is that Gwen is still in this helper or secondary character race, but she's also simultaneously being pushed into the spotlight. She is a character that faces considerably more hardship than her traditional white counterpart. For instance, Arthur accuses her of being a witch. Her father is poisoned and subsequently died, and Gwen is incarcerated. She's falsely accused and ends up losing a parent to state violence. Her relationship with Arthur doesn't actually change until she nurses him back to health at the end of the first season. So it's really, really interesting comment on race and how that plays into this portrayal of Gwen in Merlin. And I'd really encourage you guys to pick up this book by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. It explores race in Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, Merlin, and so much more. It's a very, very important commentary, and I know some of you will enjoy that, and you can get it on Amazon. Not sponsored, but I will put the link in the show notes because I think it's so important that we read things like this. Music has also referenced Guinevere, often evoking her as a symbol of beauty, romance and tragedy. The folk song Guinevere by Crosby, Stills and Nash is an ethereal and poetic reflection on love and loss. And it was actually inspired by David Crosby's real-life relationships, but uses the legendary Queen's name to evoke a sense of this sort of unreachable, idealised love. And while I was looking around for other songs that referenced Guinevere, I actually came across a suggestion that Silver Springs by Fleetwood Mac could potentially be a bit of an indirect reference to Guinevere. And I guess now that I've read that, I can kind of see it, because the lyrics have this sort of sense of an unresolved love and unfulfilled destiny, similar to how Arthur and Lancelot both suffer due to their relationships with Guinevere. They never truly achieve what they should have achieved. You've got that famous line, "You'll never get away from the sound of the woman that loves you." And that just evokes this idea of lingering love and regret, much like the inescapable consequences of Guinevere's actions. Guinevere's presence looms over Arthurian lore, shaping the destinies of the men who loved her, and Silver Springs does a pretty good job of capturing that pain of a love that just lingers. So yeah, I can definitely see it. In my head, I've got like two images right now. I've got a cool montage of scenes of Arthur, Guinevere and Lancelot set to that song, and I've also got the image of Stevie Nicks, that iconic performance, but instead of it being Stevie Nicks, it's Guinevere, and Arthur and Lancelot are in the band. So you're welcome. And that image is now in your head too, so you're welcome. In visual art, Guinevere continues to inspire contemporary painters and digital artists. John Collier's pre-Raphaelite painting of Queen Guinevere's Maying in 1900, that remains one of the most famous classical depictions of Guinevere, but modern artists have reinterpreted her in many different ways. For example, Kinuku Y Craft's lush and intricate fantasy illustrations bring this dreamlike quality to her image, often putting her in flowing gowns and walking in enchanted landscapes. And digital artists all over the internet, it's not hard to find. Pop it into Google, you can see all of the different kinds of portrayals, and some sort of blend medieval and modern aesthetics, some emphasise her warrior aspect, and it's just really interesting to see how that contrasts to the more traditional image of a passive queen. It wouldn't be Ladies of Lore if we didn't talk video games, and Guinevere appears in several of them, often as a supporting character in Arthurian-inspired narratives or as a symbolic figure representing love, betrayal or royalty. And we see this in Dark Souls of 2011, where Guinevere, Princess of Sunlight, is heavily inspired by our Guinevere, and she's depicted as a radiant and benevolent figure, but her presence is ultimately an illusion. Much like how Guinevere's role in legend is sometimes romanticised or shrouded in mystery. And there's also an Arthurian-inspired mobile RPG called Fate Grand Order, and in this Guinevere appears more indirectly through other characters. So for instance, Lancelot's backstory references his tragic love for her, and Queen Morgan, who is a version of Morgan Le Fay, plays a major role in the game's retelling of Arthurian legends. And I have to mention this one. So you remember the King Arthur movie that we just spoke about? Well, it had a video game. The video game King Arthur of 2004, which is based on the Jerry Bruckheimer film, includes Guinevere as a warrior, reflecting Keira Knightley's portrayal as we discussed earlier. Hasn't got great reviews, if I'm honest, and I did watch some YouTube videos of it being played. Can't say I pick it up, but you might like it. You might want to give it a go. So it's clear to see that from literature to film, music and art, Guinevere continues to be a compelling and versatile figure, whether depicted as a tragic lover, a strong-willed queen, or a misunderstood woman struggling against her circumstances. She remains one of the most enduring and dynamic characters of Arthurian legend. And I think that is about all we have time for today. Guinevere's story has lasted for centuries because she represents something universal: love, power, betrayal and redemption. And don't we love a redemption arc? Don't we love a story of betrayal? Maybe that's why she's been so venerated for so long, because she's been both a villain and a victim. She's been a queen and a pawn and a sinner and a saint. She's really been it all. And I hope that you've enjoyed this two-parter on Guinevere. It's definitely been the deepest of deep dives that we've done so far on the podcast. As always, please do let me know your thoughts, either in the comments, in a review, over on Blue Sky, or now on TikTok. You can find all of the links in the show notes, along with all the sources that I used to write this episode. All that's left to say is that I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.